Most of us would agree slavery is bad, but we know that our best estimates suggest that globally 50 million people live in conditions of modern slavery. But what can we do about it? And what does that have to do with us here in New Zealand? Well, many of the products we consume and the services we pay for have in their supply chains people working in modern slavery. One MP has decided they want to do something about that, and today we're lucky to be joined by Greg Fleming, Member of Parliament for Maungakiekia. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Great to be here, Thomas.
So you have a bill before the House. You're a backbencher. You are in Parliament, but not in government.
Yes.
What's your bill?
It is called the Modern Slavery Bill, so it's reducing the incidence of modern slavery, and we got it in through the private members track. So there's within Parliament, there's the two different legislative agendas. The one that's most common used is the government agenda, which is all driven from Cabinet, and then the less used one is the members track. So generally one day every second sitting block, there is a day of the House set aside to consider members' bills, yes, I was very fortunate. Through a particular process, I was able to get that bill before the House.
So when we're talking about modern slavery, how would you define modern slavery?
So modern slavery is when labour is forced. So when the person in question does not have the ability or the freedom to be able to walk away from that situation. So that can happen in terms of physical forcedness, or in terms of they find themselves in a situation where their passport has been confiscated, or it can be in a situation where those two freedoms might be available to them, but they have been placed in a situation where there are so few options to them that it is as if they are being forced to be in there. One of the most helpful places that I've come across in understanding the incidents and the stark reality of modern labour has been through the work of a guy called Matt Friedman, who runs a thing called the Midong Club based in Hong Kong, and it's a support group for about 40 to 50 of the world's largest companies, who together includes the likes of Disney and Apple and so forth, who are really serious about doing everything they can to eliminate modern slavery. And so they obviously, with their substantial operations and supply chains, they do everything they can to look into that. And so that's where Matt has spent his whole career developing skills, understanding networks, insights into that area. And to look at his material, and I've had the opportunity to have some good conversation with him, it's quite shocking what is happening internationally. Conservative estimates are there's about 50 million people globally who are in forced labour, essentially slavery situations, and he's also got so many examples of where large companies, having identified those instances, have been able to take steps that have contributed to people being freed from those situations. So it's not just about those companies going, well, I won't deal with that anymore. It's about them using their position within that to be able to actually address the incidences and see people freed.
Brilliant. So we'll get to the process in a moment, but I'm interested first in, obviously, modern slavery is a thing many people are concerned about, but how did you come to care about modern slavery as an issue you wanted to address?
Yeah, so two things. One is, before I went into politics, I had been working in the non-profit sector for about 25 years, and so it was a topic that came up quite regularly, whether I was at a public policy think tank, whether I was in organisations that were working at the front line, either directly or indirectly. It was something that I came across frequently. The second way was that when I first got elected, and I was sitting there with the senior whip in my second week in Parliament, and the senior whip explained to me that as a member I needed to have a bill, as a backbench I needed to have a bill in the members' ballot, and he said if you haven't got one ready now, we can put a placeholder in before the first draw, and that placeholder was a live bill, but it would be one that was held in the previous Parliament by a member who was either not there or who now was a minister, because ministers can't have members' bills in the ballot, because the idea being is that if you're a minister, well, you can access the main legislative agenda, so the one that I was mentioning before. And so I looked down the list of bills, and one of them was from a lady called Nicola Grigg, who's now the Minister for several things, and in fact she's just picked up the Minister for Environment portfolio in last week's Cabinet reshuffle. And it said strengthening the penalties around modern slavery and human trafficking. And I didn't read the bill, I just read the topic and the headline. I thought, well, that's a bit of me. And so I said to the senior work, put my name against that while I work on some other bills. Well, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, there was the first bill, first draw. You have 1 in 75 chances, I think, of your bill being pulled out. Mine was pulled out, and I remember I didn't go to the draw, and I was walking down through the halls in Parliament, past the library, and everyone was saying to me, "Congratulations, Greg." I said, "What's that about?" And they said, "You got your bill pulled." I was like, "Excellent! I should go and read it." And so when I did read it, it took me about 20 seconds to read it, and then I kept turning the page over and over, and realised, nope, that's it. It literally changed one section of the Crimes Act. Section, it's been so long since I've looked at it now, I think it's section 278, I think, or maybe it's section 78, and essentially it just aligned the maximum jail time for human trafficking, for a conviction of human trafficking internationally, with that of domestic. For some reason, one was less than the other. And so I looked at that and I thought, my goodness, if this is going to go right through the legislative process and take up all the time, sure, we can put more into this. And so I began, obviously as a very new MP, so I started legislating, can that be done? Discovered through a whole, through different standing orders and traditions around the House that yes, I could, within parameters, put extra things in the bill as long as they stayed within the original scope. And so began for me the process of researching. One of the first things I did was I had a chat with Nicola Grigg, and I said, where did this bill come from? She said to me, it was from 2 high school students at a local high school down, I think it was a Rangiora High School in Canterbury. And so I said, can you put me in contact with them? And so I ended up hiring both of them. They're both, by this stage, they're both, and they still are, law students, one at Canterbury, one at Wellington. And I said, hey, how about I bring you on staff, part-time contracts in Parliament? Great opportunity for them. And so I put them to work researching more. We came up with a much broader idea of the kinds of things that we could actually change. So if we're going to go through this process of attending one little part of modern slavery law, let's go more broadly. And in the process of that, I then came into contact with the incredible amount of work that Rebecca Armstrong had done at World Vision, and that Becky Kingy was doing in her previous roles, and also now working in the social justice area at ANZ Bank. There's another guy called Jacob Parry, who's a barrister in Chambers now, and Clayton Riley, who was the original prosecutor on the very famous Matamata case back in 2017. So all of these people that had done so much work, we then pulled on all of this, and then realised that we had far more than what could be done in my original bill. So we did as much as we could in the original bill, but then we set about putting another one in, and that's where the process then led to the next stage.
And I mean, I guess, many people do see a bill like this and think this is how it should be done. But I confess there are 2 things that worry me about the bill. One is I get worried when all the politicians are agreeing. And I get worried when we pass laws against something everyone agrees is bad. Because obviously modern slavery is bad. That does not mean that every intervention that is aimed at reducing modern slavery is going to be a good intervention. So how does the legislation work? How will it improve, conditions for people in modern slavery?
Yeah. So what the legislation does is it requires large companies. So the threshold that's currently in the law, and this may get reviewed at Select Committee, is $100 million turnover. So that means that in total, round figures, about 1,000 New Zealand companies will need to report annually on the auditing and the due diligence of their operations and supply chains. Now, about 300 of those 1,000 companies are already having to do this by virtue of the fact that they are headquartered in Australia, and Australia has had this kind of legislation in place for about 7 years now. In fact, the Australian experience and their review and changes of their legislation, it's always better to be a fast follower than the pioneer in this, in terms of we're not having to invent the wheel here. They're already having to do that, and so we're learning from that in New Zealand. So for those 700 additional companies that are going to need to do this, what it's going to require them to do is to each year look carefully at their operations and supply chains for evidence of instances of things that fall into the definition of modern slavery. Now, the reality of it is that a large number of companies are already doing this. And so for them, this process is going to be quite simple. It's literally going to be documenting what it is that they're already doing. But for perhaps even a larger number of companies. This will be the first time that they've done this. And international experience, and there are many countries, in fact, most of our modern trading partners, most of our major trading partners are already requiring this. Their experience has shown that companies, when they actually go onto the front foot and they go out and they look for it, they are quite stunned at what they find. And once they identify that, then they're able to be part of a large group of companies around the world who can actually address that particular issue and bring about change. And there's dozens, if not hundreds of examples in recent years of where that has actually happened. So it's simply, in its most simple form, it's about requiring New Zealand-based companies of a certain size to carefully look at their operations and supply chains for these kinds of these matters of exploitation, and then address them.
Is there anything in the legislation that defines like how deeply into the supply chains they have to look? Because we know that sort of modern supply chains are incredibly deep. That one company will be buying constituent parts for whatever their product is, but whatever their parts makers will be purchasing. Further down there'll be second, third, fourth order steps before you get to raw materials. How far into the supply chain are they going to be looking?
No, the legislation is intentionally not that prescriptive because what we're doing is we're setting up a framework which we are expecting and anticipating will evolve in conjunction with that part of MB that will be administering this process.
So with, I guess, an open-ended framework, and I wonder whether this is some of the ACT Party's critiques of the bill, is there a risk that this becomes, there is creep with a framework where bureaucrats start defining further and further kind of, I guess, boxes to tick, or is it expected that companies will pick up this framework and it's a sort of industry-led engagement? Do you have concerns?
Well, yes, it's the latter that we're aiming for. But yes, of course, we're aware of the dangers of the former. I mean, it's the very nature of government to ever expand, right? Government's very nature is like a fast-growing bush. It needs a good prune on a regular basis. And again, when I look at overseas examples, I look at Australia's example, UK, Canada, California, because in the US it's been done more on a state basis, then these are the kinds of constant tweaks and evolution that you can do, which is one of the reasons why we've designed the legislation that the details and the specifics can all be done through the regulation. So you'll be aware of secondary legislation. So for viewers, listeners, for whom that's a new term, it just means that when you put primary legislation into place, you allow for, if need be, you allow for ongoing changes and developments, tweaks to be done through secondary legislation. So it's a part of the primary legislation that empowers the relevant minister to be able to make changes. They have to get sign-off through the cabinet, so it's called an order and council. And it still has to go to the Governor General for signing off, so because it is actual legislation, but you don't have to go right back through the House, so you can make these tweaks, and that's what we're allowing for, because we are anticipating that it will be an evolving process. Yeah.
And so then the other question that comes to mind for me is obviously in different parts of the world, particularly more impoverished parts, the criteria for what constitutes good work is perhaps a lower bar, that there are things that we recognise in other countries are necessary to allow that we wouldn't tolerate in New Zealand. For example, New Zealand's minimum wage would not be good to be imposed as a global minimum wage, because it would be fundamentally inapplicable in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And some people would go further. The argument is made by, I guess, people on the more libertarian end of the spectrum that in a stage of global development for countries that are really impoverished, that things that look to Western eyes to be kind of terrible working conditions, modern slavery, are actually a necessary stepping stone on the road to becoming a developed country.
Yeah.
What would you say to critics of your bill on that basis?
I would just say there's a misunderstanding of what we mean by modern slavery. So for us, modern slavery isn't any of those things. So we absolutely agree with your cautions. Modern slavery is about forced labour. It's where people literally don't have the choice as to whether they're performing those tasks or not.
Okay, so your understanding of what your bill is aiming to achieve is that it is not for difficult working conditions and low wages. It is for compelled labour.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think there's any risk that definition changes through secondary legislation?
No, and that's not up for grabs. Yeah.
Do you think that members from the other side of the House, as getting back to the political complexity, would want to push to extend that definition throughout the select committee process?
Well, we can never presuppose exactly what they'll do, but that's well beyond the scope of what this legislation is. That would be such a substantial change of what we've been pushing that it probably wouldn't even be signed off by the Clerk of the House.
Excellent. And what has been the reception you've got from, I guess, businesses of a size that they would be affected? There's obviously a number of businesses who are already doing these kind of processes, but for those who are not, who will have new requirements imposed upon them, what's the sort of feedback you've received?
Yeah, overwhelmingly positive. In fact, I'm just trying to think whether I've heard from a single company yet who said that they're concerned about this. No, in fact, there have been a couple of very large companies that have contacted me to discuss this, but it's always been about, okay, so where are you up to with the legislative process? What's likely to be required of us? When is this going to come in and the like? So, no, overwhelmingly, people are can see that this is actually going to be a good thing. Yeah.
And when is it going to? Where are you in the process? Where do you expect it to come in if it manages to pass all the way through?
I'm actually, right now, as we record this, I'm optimistic that we could see the bill come up for its first reading at the next Members' Day. So that could be in about 3 weeks from now. If that doesn't happen, then I'm still very confident that it'll happen this side of the election.
Excellent. And then one final question I have, and we look forward to seeing the progress it makes. But you've got this bill, in the works. But when it comes through, you've got another opportunity to put a member's bill in the tin or to bypass the process entirely.
Yeah.
Do you have any issues that you are nursing that you might be looking to raise?
Nothing specifically that I'm looking to exercise section or standing order 280 for. The members' bill that I have now got in the head is something on a very different issue. It's it came from the first night that I went out on community patrol in Onehunga. I'd only been an MP for a handful of weeks, and I met up with our 2 local constables and said to them, busy night out protecting the community, and they laughed and said, no, we've been at the Warriors game. And I was like, you what? And they said, yeah, we spend over 50% of our time policing events like this. And I was like, you're kidding. Like, we already don't have enough local constables on the beat, and we know that there's a direct correlation between police presence and lowering crime. So I began spitballing ideas of how we could change that. From that, what we came up with, the idea was actually looking at what they've allowed in the UK and then more recently in New South Wales, which is simply allowing police to charge for their time at for-profit large-scale events. So it basically would mean that the Warriors might have to add on an extra 50 cents or $1 per ticket because they'd actually be paying the police for that time. What that would allow is for the police to offer overtime to non-rostered officers. Hey, who wants to go to the Warriors game and earn extra cash, thereby leaving the on-rostered police on the front line? So I worked through the process of that, worked with the Assistant Police Commissioner and got signed off by the Police Minister, my caucus, and now that bill sits in the members' tin. I don't think that's something that would meet the threshold of across the House feeling so passionately about it that we would bypass. But I would like, if I get the chance to serve in Parliament for any extended period of time, and I'm in a position where I'm able to influence more of the strategic conversations of how the House operates, I would love to help members' days evolve to the point where Standing Order 280 is the standard way of operating rather than the exception. What I mean by that is that we, as I've explained before, members' days are pretty rare, and they do offer the opportunity for the House to work collaboratively. The only reason why we only get through 2 to 3 items each time is because they're still, in most bills, run in a partisan way, and so you have one team trying to stall the progress of the other team. Well, whereas if the legislation that was before the House had already been agreed on, like Camilla and I did with our bill, then instead of people taking full 5 to 10 minute speeches and dragging out the committee of the whole House stage, you could get everyone could be taking 60 to 90-second speeches, getting them through quickly. The committee of the whole House could be done within 15, 20 minutes because you'd recognise that the legislation had already been gone through very carefully at the select committee stage, which in my experience, my observation is the truly valuable part of the legislative process. Pretty much every other stage is really theatrical. Then you could get through 4, 5, 6 items every members' day. So that's my grand vision for what members' days could look like. Let it be.
Well, we look forward to seeing how the rhythms of Parliament may change over the next few years. Thank you very much, Greg, for your time.
Thanks, Thomas.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of the Maxim Institute podcast. Like and subscribe for more interviews like this.